Okay.
So, Julian, thanks so much for joining me today.
Great to be with you, Jack.
And so, yeah, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit because, you know, the constituency you represent in Melbourne, it's one of the highest concentrations of Cambodian-born Australians, I believe. And obviously, our latest investigation is focused on Cambodia's ruling elite's actions and investments in Australia. Over the last 5 years, the ruling party, the CPP, has deployed a mixture, as I'm sure you're aware, of sort of charm and bullying tactics in the hope of stifling dissent among Australia's Cambodian community. And what RFA's latest investigation has found is that over the same 5 years, the CPP's top families have invested tens of millions of dollars in Australian businesses and real estate, and much of it in the city that you represent in Parliament, Melbourne. Do you see a connection between these two trends?
Look, it's great to be with you. And yes, I'm proud to represent a wonderful, vibrant Australian Cambodian community. It's through the local Cambodian Australians that I've got to know Cambodian culture and fallen in love really with the Cambodian people, and also the history in recent decades. It's of enormous concern to me as someone who loves the Cambodian community and believes in democracy and human rights to really understand more about what's going on. And I congratulate you and RFA on the investigative work that you've done to uncover this. I'm deeply concerned that I think, as Kem Monavithya said, that Australia has become the #1 destination for Cambodia's thugs, and that we're becoming, so the Cambodian diaspora tell us, the favoured place for the corrupt elite, for Hun Sen's gangster regime, his family and cronies, to take corrupt money gained from human rights and invested in Australia, and that's of enormous concern.
And like many countries, Australia offers visas to foreign nationals willing to invest in the local economy. What we found is that over the last 5 years, that same period, wealthy Cambodians invested a total of 38.5 million Australian dollars in support of visas like that. And while the Department for Home Affairs insists that all of the funds and applicants are rigorously vetted, a lot of observers aren't so convinced. Do you think that when it comes to authoritarian countries like Cambodia, that Australian immigration authorities need to be doing more to vet the applicants for these visas?
You've raised in your work really important questions. They're questions that no doubt concern millions of Cambodians. Where is this money coming from? The people who are investing this money, if you look at it, they're not paid big salaries by the government, and yet they're able to afford multi-million-dollar apartments and houses and businesses in some of the most expensive suburbs in Australia. It just doesn't add up. I think the example you gave, that the son of the land management minister, Chia Sofara, in 2016 with his wife, bought an $11 million house in Sydney. And that's just one example. There are many of these. And so it does raise serious concerns about where the money's coming from. When I was in Cambodia just over a year ago, I met with democracy groups, human rights groups. I sat down with farmers who'd had their land stolen by the government and big corporations. And the consistent message that we got back was that Hun Sen's government is not treating us fairly. They're not respecting human rights. They've stopped any pretense of having a democracy and democratic norms. But they did not want Western countries like Australia to be aiding and abetting these crimes, to give a safe haven for this corrupt elite and their children and family to have a lovely life here and buy property using money that's been stolen from ordinary Cambodians. And I believe Australia does need to do more to make sure that every dollar that comes in the country is not gained from the proceeds of human rights abuses, from corruption. And to that end, I've been a big supporter of the new Magnitsky laws that the Parliamentary Committee unanimously recommended should be introduced in Australia, which would give Australia the power to target not countries, but individuals accused of serious or gross human rights violations. In other countries, such as America, there have been a number of senior Cambodian generals and some of the corrupt elite that have now been targeted, which means that they will never get visas to visit Australia, and they never would be able to take their money out of Australia or bring more money in. They're the kind of things which we need to have a serious look at, given the scale of what we understand may be going on.
And speaking of taking a serious look at things, late last year you filed a parliamentary question drawing the Australian government's attention to a pair of investigations by RFA and Al Jazeera, linking senior figures in the Cambodian regime to fraudulent investment schemes that were shut down by the Australian financial regulators. Can you tell me a little bit about what the Australian government's response has been to that question?
Well, I actually got the response only a few days ago, and the response is pathetic. They did not respond in any meaningful way. Frankly, they were like school children, not government ministers. They went through the questions and they said, we can't direct the criminal intelligence organisation or the organisation that looks at money coming in and out of the country. We can't direct these bodies because they're independent. Well, of course, sure, they can't direct them, but they could have taken the concerns seriously and even referred them to those bodies. So it's an incredibly disappointing response. What it shows is that they're not taking these concerns seriously, and that's a great disappointment. And so, as I said, the Magnitsky sanction laws, I think, are one tool, but we already have anti-money laundering laws. Many of these concerns have been reported by others, I know, to the Australian authorities, but I think Australian government ministers need to take these concerns far more seriously. I don't know why the government's avoiding these questions. What have they got to hide?
And, as I mentioned earlier, Melbourne, the city you represent, it's home to Australia's largest Cambodian community. And what impact has this kind of influx of CPP-linked money and political activities over the last half decade had on your constituents?
Well, it's impacted people in many different ways. Firstly, I'd point out that over the last 5 years or so, we have seen reports and heard reports, and I think your article and work has mentioned this, that there's been a much more concerted effort by Hun Sen's gangster regime and his cronies to infiltrate Australia and try and shut down dissent in the diaspora. So that's taken a range of forms. I call this foreign interference, and Australia's introduced a few years ago laws against foreign interference. I've raised concerns, and again, I don't think the Australian government's taking this issue nearly seriously enough. We've seen reports of intimidation, actual threats against people in Australia, Australian citizens who speak up for democracy and human rights in Cambodia, concerns about the safety of their family and friends who live in Cambodia. But we've seen a very deliberate effort by the CPP, Hun Sen's political party. This is the party that won 125 seats out of 125 seats in the election. I mean, it's a joke. It wasn't a democratic election. But we've seen that political party now set up chapters in every state and territory in Australia. Now, each of these chapters is headed by a senior general or one of the operatives in the Hun Sen regime. Their purpose is not benign. Their purpose is to put pressure on activists and outspoken people in Australia to shut dissent down, to stop people criticising what's going on in Cambodia from Australia. And the latest tactic, which I'm deeply concerned about it, and I'll be speaking again in the Parliament about, is we've seen this around the world, that Hun Sen's now started these mass trials of hundreds of people who don't live in Cambodia. Many of them have not been to Cambodia for years or decades, but what they've done, their so-called crime, is to speak up publicly, be it in Australia or Canada or the US or Europe or other countries, to speak up and say what's happening in Cambodia is not good. The government is stealing money from people. The government is taking people's land. The government is not respecting human rights. And apparently now, in Hun Sen's world, someone in Australia saying these truths is now a crime because they're creating dissent. So I think this is a terrible new tactic, and the Australian government needs to also push back on it. Our ambassador has raised these concerns with the Cambodian Minister for Justice, but we need stronger action. This is completely unacceptable that citizens in democracies around the world will be threatened by this gangster simply for speaking up in support of democracy and human rights, common human values.
And the impression I get from speaking to you is that the CPP's activities in Australia and in Cambodia, as they relate to Australian citizens, are effectively curtailing the fundamental civic rights of Australian citizens. And I'm just wondering, I know you said that you're not sure why the government seems so reluctant to take a firmer stance on these issues, but this is an issue that you've worked on quite extensively. I'm curious, do you have any inkling as to why it might be that they're so reluctant?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, these are issues that go to our democratic rights and freedoms in Australia and the freedom of speech rights that any Australian citizen, whatever their cultural and ethnic or religious background, that anyone who is an Australian citizen living here in Australia can express their mind. They can say what they want within reason. You know, they can't incite violence, but they can pretty much speak their mind. I don't agree with everything that people say to me. It's a free country, as we say. That's a good thing. But I don't understand why the Australian government is not speaking up more in support of people's rights here in Australia. Now, there was one reason, and it was in place for some years, that our current Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, not a man that I like or support, but he's the Prime Minister, he was originally the Immigration Minister, and he was seen in Cambodia drinking champagne with Hun Sen and his generals and cronies when he signed an appalling refugee deal, in return for which Australia gave Cambodia some millions, tens of millions of dollars, in return for Cambodia taking a few refugees. I think only 3 or 4 people went there in the end. It was a ridiculous arrangement. Now, that made a political constraint for some years on Scott Morrison from speaking out, but that deal is no more. It's lapsed, it's gone. So that constraint's not there. So I do not understand why the Australian government is so weak, so shameful, so silent. But myself and other Labor members of Parliament, and I would hope decent members of the government, would expect the Australian government, whatever their politics, whether they're Labor, Liberal, any other kind of government, we should expect our Australian government in a democracy to speak up for these values and to defend and protect the rights of Australian citizens to speak their mind, to speak up for Australian values here in Australia. One of the people charged is a guy called Hong Lim, who's a friend of mine. He was a state member of Parliament. He's of Cambodian descent. I think he was the first Cambodian-born person to be elected to a parliament in a Western democracy anywhere in the world. And he served for 20 years. He served with distinction. He's been charged by Hun Sen's regime simply for speaking up for democracy and human rights. So on that basis, I could receive a criminal charge for Hun Sen. So could just about any member of the Australian Parliament. It could happen in the UK, anywhere around the world, and it's not acceptable.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Good to talk with you, Jack.
Likewise.